What kind of family leaves you for dead just to enjoy a luxurious vacation? I never thought I'd be the kind of person to write a Reddit post about my family. But here I am, lying in bed, still recovering, still trying to process how my own blood left me for dead, just so they could sip champagne in Paris. It still doesn't feel real. I've always been the responsible one. The one who made sure bills were paid, who checked in on my parents regularly, who kept everything in order. Meanwhile, my younger sister, Hannah, was the golden child. The one who never had to lift a finger because our parents believed she deserved an easy life. And I accepted it. I told myself that as long as I worked hard, as long as I proved my worth, they would one day see me, not just as the reliable one, but as someone they actually valued. I was wrong. A few weeks ago, I got sick. Not just a little under the weather, but dangerously ill. Fever so high I could barely stand, my chest so tight I couldn't breathe properly. I knew something was seriously wrong, so I begged my family to take me to the hospital. They laughed. My mother told me they were leaving for France the next morning, and I'd figure it out. My sister looked at me with disgust and told me not to ruin their trip. My father? He hesitated. For a moment, I thought, maybe, just maybe, he would step in. But then the taxi horn honked outside, and he grabbed his suitcase. And just like that, they left. I collapsed onto the floor alone. This shocking story from r/true off my chest will make you question what family really means. If you enjoy shocking real-life stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Follow Reddit True Vault for more. I grew up knowing one thing for certain. Hannah was the golden child, and I was just there. From the moment she was born, my parents doted on her like she was some kind of miracle. I was only 4 at the time, but I remember how the world seemed to shift the day they brought her home from the hospital. My mother, Teresa, beamed down at her with this adoration I don't think she ever looked at me with. My father, Thomas, was never an overly affectionate man, but with Hannah, he was softer, gentler, completely different from the strict, no-nonsense dad I knew. I was expected to grow up fast, to take on responsibilities, to understand. Hannah, on the other hand, was allowed to be fragile, needy. She was coddled, her every whim indulged. If she so much as sniffled, my mother would rush to her side with warm soup and soft words. But when I got sick, "You're strong, Veronica. You'll be fine." It started small. When Hannah threw a tantrum, I was told to let her have it because she was younger. When she made a mess, I was the one cleaning up. By the time we were in school, it was glaringly obvious. Hannah could do no wrong. She wanted ballet lessons? Done. She wanted the newest American Girl doll? Bought the next day. She wanted to go to an exclusive summer camp? My parents paid without blinking. Meanwhile, I was expected to fend for myself. At 16, while Hannah was out with friends showing off the latest designer bag my parents had bought her, I was working my first part-time job at a local diner, scrubbing tables and saving every penny so I could one day afford college. I still remember the way my hands smelled of dish soap long after my shifts, the ache in my feet after standing for 8 hours straight, and the humiliation I felt when my parents made me wear Hannah's hand-me-downs to school. They weren't even subtle about it. "Ronnie, you're so practical. You don't care about clothes the way Hannah does," my mother would say, as if that somehow justified why my sister got brand new outfits while I got her old ones. I remember the burning shame of sitting in a cafeteria where kids whispered about how my jeans were last season style, jeans that had once belonged to my sister. Meanwhile, Hannah bragged about her shopping sprees, tossing her new clothes on her bed like they were nothing. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was strong, that I would make my own way in the world. And I did. I worked my ass off, got into college, and paid my own way with scholarships and part-time jobs. No one helped me. Not once. My parents didn't even offer. It was just assumed that I'd handle it myself. After all, I was so responsible, while Hannah was fragile and needed support. But the worst part? Even after I graduated and landed a successful career in finance, they still never saw me as an equal. Instead, I became their personal financial planner. I helped them budget, paid their bills when they needed it, and made sure their assets were secure. Not out of obligation, but because I thought that maybe, just maybe, if I took care of them, they would finally see me, acknowledge me, love me. But they never did. Hannah, on the other hand, took a very different path. After college, which she barely scraped through, thanks to my parents paying for tutors, she decided to become an influencer. Or, at least, that's what she called it. She spent her days posing for Instagram, pretending to live this luxurious lifestyle, when in reality, my parents were the ones bankrolling every single part of it. They paid for her apartment in downtown Chicago, covered her rent, her clothes, her endless networking trips to LA and Miami. And yet, despite all of that, she still resented me. Why does she get to have a stable job while I have to work so hard for social media? That's what she told my parents once during one of her self-pitying tantrums. And do you know what their response was? Not laughter, not a reality check. They actually comforted her, told her that she was special, that being an influencer was hard work, that I had it easier because I just sat in an office all day while she had to hustle to maintain her online presence. I wanted to scream, but instead, I swallowed my frustration, just like I had my whole life. I kept telling myself that it didn't matter, that I was strong, that I had my own life, my own career. I didn't need their validation, but deep down I did. I wanted, just once, for them to look at me the way they looked at Hannah, to acknowledge how much I had sacrificed, how much I had given up. But that moment never came, and soon, I would learn just how little I truly meant to them. I don't even know how long I had been pushing myself before my body finally gave out. Exhaustion had become second nature to me. I spent my days balancing work, handling my own bills, and even managing my parents' finances. It was always me who had to step up, to be responsible, to fix things. Even when it came to Hannah, I was the one quietly covering for her mistakes. Whether that meant fixing a botched credit card payment or politely declining one of her more ridiculous financial requests on behalf of our parents. But this time, my body refused to cooperate. It started with a dull headache, one I brushed off because I had work to do. By midday, my skin burned like fire, my limbs ached, and the numbers on my screen blurred together. Even the simple act of typing felt like my fingers were made of lead. By the time I finally made it home, my hands trembled so badly that I struggled to fit the key into the lock. Every inch of my body throbbed with fatigue. My throat was raw, my breathing shallow. I barely managed to kick off my shoes before collapsing onto the couch. I needed rest. Just a few hours, I told myself. By morning, I'd feel better. Except I didn't. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sheets clinging to my body. My head pounded, and my chest felt unbearably tight, as though something heavy was pressing down on me. I reached toward my nightstand, only to realize that my phone was dead. Panic crept in. I needed help. My legs barely supported me as I tried to stand. The floor tilted under me, and I had to grip the walls just to make it to the bathroom. One look in the mirror was enough to tell me this wasn't just a simple fever. My face was pale, my lips cracked, my eyes sunken. Dragging myself back to bed, I reached for the landline. Thank God I still had one. I dialed my parents' number, each ring echoing through the silent room. When my mother finally answered, her voice was sharp, impatient. I barely had the strength to speak, but I forced the words out anyway. My fever was high. I couldn't stand properly. I needed to go to the hospital. Silence. Then a sigh. There was no concern in her voice, only irritation. She told me that they had a flight to catch in the morning and couldn't just cancel everything because of a little cold. A little cold. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I tried again. I told her I could barely breathe, that something was wrong. She dismissed me with a casual suggestion to take some medicine from the kitchen and rest. She assured me I'd be fine by tomorrow. And then, in the background, I heard Hannah. Light, airy, and completely unbothered. She complained about me making a big deal out of nothing, saying that I always did this. Did what exactly? Get sick? Need help? I heard my father hesitate, his voice uncertain. For a brief moment, I thought he might step in. But my mother cut him off, her voice sharp. They had been planning this trip for months. She wasn't going to let me ruin it. And just like that, the call ended. I sat there, phone still clutched in my trembling hands, staring at the wall in disbelief. This wasn't an emergency to them. I wasn't an emergency to them. I didn't know how long I lay there before I heard them downstairs, their voices full of excitement as they finalized their packing. Suitcases rolled across the hardwood floor, laughter spilling through the house. I forced myself up, my entire body screaming in protest. My vision blurred, and black spots danced at the edges of my sight. But I had to try. Halfway down the stairs, my knees buckled. My breathing hitched, my chest tightening painfully. I gasped, calling out for them, telling them something was wrong. My father turned to look at me. His expression flickered with hesitation, concern creeping into his features. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he would stay. But then my mother grabbed his arm. Her movements were impatient, dismissive. She reminded him that they had to go, that I would be fine. Finally, she turned to me, her expression unbothered. If I was really that bad, she told me, there was medicine in the kitchen. I should just take some and sleep it off. Hannah sighed, exasperated, and assured me that they'd bring me something nice from Paris. Then she smirked, as if this was all a joke. And then, just like that, they walked out the door. The sound of the lock clicking was the last thing I heard before the silence settled in. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I barely made it back to my room before collapsing onto the floor. My limbs felt too heavy to move, my body buzzing with static. I tried to reach for my phone again, but my strength gave out. Darkness overtook me, and then everything went black. When I finally opened my eyes, everything was too bright. The fluorescent lights above me cast a sterile glow, the kind that immediately told me I wasn't at home. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor filled the otherwise quiet room, and as I tried to shift, a dull ache spread through my entire body. My throat felt raw, my limbs were heavy, and there was an four taped to my arm. It took a few seconds for my brain to catch up. Hospital. I was in a hospital. Before I could fully process that, I became aware of movement beside me. A familiar presence, tense and restless. Madison. Even before I turned my head, I could feel the weight of her stare. When I finally managed to look at her, the exhaustion on her face was unmistakable. Her normally sharp and put-together appearance was gone. Her hair was messy, her eyes red-rimmed like she had been crying. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. The second she noticed I was awake, relief washed over her face, but it was quickly replaced by something else, something darker. There was no need for her to say anything. The way she gripped my hand, the way her jaw clenched, it was all I needed to know that something had gone very, very wrong. I tried to ask what had happened, but only a weak croak escaped my lips. My throat burned. Every breath felt like I was inhaling fire. Madison didn't hesitate, reaching for a cup of water on the bedside table and helping me take a few careful sips. Even before I could ask, she exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on my hand. I had almost died. The words didn't need to be spoken aloud for me to understand. The weight of them settled deep in my chest, sending a chill through me despite the fever still lingering in my body. The last thing I remembered was collapsing in my bedroom, the unbearable heat pressing down on me. Everything after that was a blur. Madison had been the one to find me. She had come to check in after I stopped answering her messages. When I didn't respond to her calls, she knocked. When I didn't answer the door, she let herself in using the spare key I had given her years ago. She had found me on the floor, unconscious, barely breathing. The paramedics told her I had severe pneumonia. My oxygen levels had been dangerously low. If she had found me even a few hours later, I might not have woken up at all. I could have died, and my family had left me there. A fresh wave of nausea rolled over me, but it had nothing to do with my illness. Madison didn't stop there. She told me that while I had been in the hospital, fighting for my life, my family had been in Paris, posting pictures, drinking wine, taking selfies in front of the Eiffel Tower. She showed me the proof. Her phone screen was filled with images. My mother, my father, and Hannah, dressed in designer outfits, smiling as if they were the happiest family in the world. Captions full of hashtags about their once-in-a-lifetime trip. Not a single message. Not a single call. Not even a passing thought about the daughter they had abandoned. And then came the final blow. Madison had been so furious that she couldn't keep quiet. She had written about what happened, about how my own family had left me to die just so they wouldn't have to cancel their vacation. She hadn't named names, but the post had gone viral. People were horrified, disgusted. The backlash had already begun. Hannah's Instagram was flooded with comments demanding to know how she could party in Paris while her sister was in the hospital. People were unfollowing her by the thousands. Some even tagged brands she worked with, urging them to cut ties. My father's business was being hit just as hard. His company's page was filled with scathing reviews. Clients were canceling their policies, stating they wanted nothing to do with a man who could abandon his own child. They had spent their entire lives treating me as if I were disposable, as if I only mattered when I was useful to them. But now, for the first time, they were facing real consequences, and they had no idea what was waiting for them when they got home. Lying in my hospital bed, I sensed their arrival before I even saw them. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, just a series of small details that built up to the inevitable. The way the nurses exchanged glances at the front desk, as if trying to decide who would be the one to deliver the news. The way Madison's grip on her phone tightened, her jaw clenching ever so slightly as she glanced at a notification. Even the doctor, who had been professional but distant, hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping into my room that morning. There was a shift in the air, one that sent a dull wave of exhaustion through my already weakened body. They were back from Paris, and now, after days of silence, after treating me like an afterthought, they had suddenly remembered I existed. I didn't have to wonder how things had unraveled for them. Madison had already filled in the gaps while sitting by my bedside, her voice laced with a quiet sort of satisfaction. The fallout had been swift, brutal, and entirely deserved. My father's business, once built on a reputation of trust and reliability, was crumbling under the weight of public outrage. Clients were cutting ties, online reviews were condemning him, and former business partners were distancing themselves as if he carried a contagious disease. No one wanted to be associated with the man who had abandoned his sick daughter for the sake of a vacation. Hannah wasn't doing any better. Her Instagram, once a carefully curated highlight reel of luxury and influence, had turned into a battlefield. Brands had pulled their sponsorships, followers were dropping by the thousands, and her once adoring audience had turned against her. The internet had found its latest villain, and she was at the center of it. And now, after days of pretending I wasn't their problem, they had finally shown up, ready to play the role of the concerned family. But I wasn't the same person they had left behind. A knock came at the door. I didn't react. I didn't need to. Madison was already moving, her body tense, her expression unreadable as she exchanged a glance with the nurse standing at the threshold. The nurse hesitated before stepping inside, clearing her throat as she braced herself for my response. She spoke carefully, gently, as if unsure how I would take the news. My parents and Hannah were here. It wasn't a question. Madison didn't speak, but I could feel her watching me, waiting. I already knew what I would say. I had known from the moment I regained consciousness and realized what they had done. There was nothing left to say. They could leave. The words left my lips with more steadiness than I expected. The nurse hesitated, but then she nodded, stepping back into the hallway. I didn't need to hear what was happening outside my door to know how they would react. First came my mother. She was always the first to play the victim, always the first to twist a situation to make herself seem like the one who had been wronged. I could already picture the way her face contorted in exaggerated disbelief, the way her voice trembled just enough to make her outburst seem heartfelt rather than manipulative. She demanded to see me, insisted that as my mother, she had a right to be by my side. It was almost laughable, the audacity of it. She had given up that right the moment she turned her back on me and walked out that door. Then came my father. He was quieter, more measured, but no less desperate. He tried to reason with the nurse, tried to insist that this was all just a misunderstanding. But no amount of pleading could erase what had already been done. And then, of course, there was Hannah. Unlike our parents, she wasn't interested in playing the role of the regretful family member. She was angry, not because she felt guilty, not because she had realized the consequences of her actions, but because I refused to go along with the carefully constructed narrative she had built in her head. She dismissed the entire situation as an overreaction, ridiculed the idea that leaving me behind had been anything more than an unfortunate inconvenience. I could almost hear the frustration in her voice, the disbelief that I wasn't simply letting this go. Madison shifted beside me. I didn't need to hear exactly what she said, but I knew her well enough to imagine it. The sharpness in her tone, the way she shut Hannah down with a few well-placed words. By the time Madison returned to my bedside, she looked satisfied. They were gone, but I knew they would be back. People like them always came back when they needed something. The difference was, this time, I wasn't the one who would be left begging. Losing everything happened slowly at first, then all at once. At least, that's how it seemed when my parents' world began crumbling around them. It started with my father's business. The moment the story broke online, the backlash was swift and merciless. His clients weren't just angry, they were disgusted. They had trusted him, had believed in the image he carefully maintained as a responsible businessman, a family man. But when they found out he had abandoned his sick daughter to go on vacation, that trust shattered like glass. One by one, contracts were terminated. Longtime business partners distanced themselves. Even the most loyal clients couldn't justify staying with a man who had proven himself so utterly heartless. It didn't take long before the financial strain became unbearable. At first, my father tried to pretend everything was fine, as if sheer denial could somehow reverse the damage. He assured my mother they could recover, that they just needed to do damage control, spin the situation in a way that would paint him as the victim of a misunderstanding. But public opinion wasn't so easily swayed, and the numbers didn't lie. With the company hemorrhaging money and no new business coming in, the walls started closing in. He took out loans, desperate to keep everything afloat, but it was like trying to patch a sinking ship with duct tape. The business was drowning, and then, finally, it collapsed. I didn't have to be there to know how it played out. Madison had kept an eye on the situation for me, feeding me bits of information when I asked. When the inevitable day arrived, when my parents had to accept that their livelihood was gone, I imagined my father sitting in his office, staring at the final foreclosure notice in his hands. I wondered if, in that moment, he finally realized that this was his fault, that he had done this, that it had all led back to the day he turned his back on me. As for my mother, she tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy at first. I could picture her sitting in the kitchen, flipping through her fashion magazines, pretending like none of this was happening. But reality had a way of seeping in through the cracks, no matter how much she tried to keep it out. Eventually, they were forced to sell the house where I had spent years trying to prove myself to them, the house where I had collapsed on the floor, burning with fever, while they packed their suitcases, the house that had never really felt like home. I imagined the final moments before they left it behind, my mother standing in the doorway, looking around as if hoping to find some way to hold on to it. My father locking up for the last time, his shoulders heavy with the weight of everything he had lost. And yet, even as they were forced to let go of their carefully constructed life, I knew that I still wasn't the thing they missed the most. No, the person truly grieving her loss was Hannah. Her life had been built on an illusion, one carefully curated through filters and brand deals and an endless supply of praise. But when that illusion shattered, when the sponsorships disappeared and the followers turned on her, she was left with nothing but the reality she had always tried to ignore. And she didn't handle it well. Madison told me how Hannah tried to fight back, how she made vague posts about cancel culture and haters who didn't understand her truth. But the damage had already been done. Her reputation was ruined. The influencer friends she had once flaunted online suddenly had no interest in being associated with her. The lavish lifestyle she had paraded around like a trophy crumbled beneath her feet. For the first time in her life, Hannah was being held accountable for something, and she hated it. As their lives spiraled further out of control, my parents did the one thing they had always done when they faced a problem too big to handle. They tried to put it on me. At first, it was just calls, constant, unrelenting calls. My phone would light up at all hours, their names appearing on my screen like ghosts from a life I had left behind. Then came the emails, the messages on social media, even handwritten letters sent to my office. They begged. They pleaded. They swore they had learned their lesson, that they understood how wrong they had been. They told me they needed me, that I was still their daughter, that family should forgive. But I had already spent my entire life giving them more chances than they deserved. I blocked every number, ignored every attempt to reach me. I refused to let them drag me back into their mess, refused to be the one to fix the disaster they had created. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Really, truly free. I packed my bags and left the city that had held so many bad memories. I found an apartment in a neighborhood where no one knew my name, where I could start fresh without the weight of my past pressing down on me. I changed my number, deleted the last remnants of them from my life. And as I stood in my new place, surrounded by the quiet hum of a life that was finally mine, I realized something. I wasn't grieving. I wasn't looking back. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I was moving forward. Without them, some wounds never fully heal. They fade, they scab over, but the scars remain, a reminder of the pain, of the betrayal, of the moment you realized the people who were supposed to love you the most never really did. For a long time, I thought family was something unbreakable, something that tied you together no matter what. I thought that if I tried hard enough, if I gave enough, if I proved myself enough, they would finally see me as worthy. But I was wrong. Some families are toxic. And just because they share your blood doesn't mean they deserve a place in your life. The hardest lesson I learned? If they can leave you behind once, they can do it again. I spent years believing that no matter how badly they treated me, at the end of the day, we were still family. But family doesn't abandon you when you need them the most. Family doesn't lock the door behind them and walk away while you're fighting to breathe. I used to be afraid of losing them, but now I realize I never had them to begin with. This is a real story from r/True Off My Chest, where thousands of people shared their shock and disbelief at what happened to me. And now, I want to ask you, What would you do if your family abandoned you like this? Would you ever forgive them? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to hear more shocking real-life stories, don't forget to like, share, and follow Reddit True Vault.